Second Samuel. We're walking our way through the former prophets, and now that Saul has died, we are really ready to begin Second Samuel. And you remember, of course, that Samuel is part of a bigger story about how God is going to glorify himself by defeating sin and by saving sinners and by establishing a kingdom. And one of the things that Samuel has been reminding us is that kingdom needs a king. Not just any kind of king, a certain kind of king. And Saul gave us a picture of the wrong kind of king, and David gives us glimpses of the kind of king that we need. And so far we've seen that God is looking for the heart, and that heart needs to be filled with faith and with obedience and with submission to God's plan and God's agenda, which is why after anointing David as king, or setting him apart as the next king, David goes into the wilderness for a time of testing. And honestly, David does somewhat well in the wilderness, a little better maybe than Israel did in their time in the wilderness, but he doesn't completely succeed in the wilderness. And yet God is faithful. And now that we have come to the end of David's wanderings in the wilderness, it is time for him to be established as king in 2 Samuel. But before the writer dives into the details of David's kingship, he takes a chapter to make clear that David did not ascend to the throne of Israel using wicked or backhanded methods. While Saul was out there being killed by the Philistines, David was striking down the Amalekites. And after returning from battle, a man comes to David who had heard of Saul's death, and he had traveled around 80 miles to see David. And he must have thought this was a great opportunity to gain something for himself, as David now would be rising to power. And perhaps he thought he was bringing news that David would want to hear. And so he lies to him about the way in which Saul died. He said he was the one who killed Saul, when we know from the last chapter of 1 Samuel that Saul actually committed suicide. But what must have happened is that this man came upon Saul after Saul died and stole the crown and Saul's armlet, and he rushed off to find David in order to be rewarded. And this is an important moment, because if there are any supporters of Saul in Israel, they might have wondered how David came to have Saul's crown and armlet. And it's possible they could have used that as a means to discredit the legitimacy of David's rule. And here, however, we see that David did not come to have these because of any actions he himself had taken against Saul. The opposite. We see David's sorrow in the death of Saul, and especially in the death of Jonathan. He is heartbroken to hear this news. 2 Samuel 1 verse 12 says, "Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with them, and they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." Now, of course, the man who had brought this news to David must have thought that he was going to be rewarded for doing this, and he ends up receiving a very different reward than what he originally expected. David does some investigating to make sure this man really knew what he was doing by asking him some questions. He asks him first, "Where did you come from?" And the man responds by saying that his father was an Amalekite, and the term he uses here to describe him is a sojourner, which was a way of saying that his father had identified himself with the Israelites. And for that to happen, he would have had to submit to the Torah. So this man wasn't a stranger to Israel. He knew what was happening in Israel, and he had some idea of what God expected from Israel. And because of that, David goes on to ask him, how is it possible that he wasn't afraid to kill the one God had set apart as king? And you see that David is actually completely submissive to God's plan. Sometimes people think that there are times when it's permissible, in order for God's will to be accomplished, for a person to disobey or compromise spiritually. But David didn't think that. Although he had been told that he would become king, he wasn't willing to take matters into his own hands, and he was angry when anyone else attempted to do so, and David commands one of his young men to execute the Amalekite for his confession. And what a warning we find in this, you know? First, we're reminded of the importance of trusting God to accomplish his plan. And we see this in Jesus, even as he says, "Not my will, but thy will be done." And second, we're reminded of the danger of deception. This Amalekite took advantage of this situation for his own gain, lying to do so. And the result was that he actually set a trap for himself. God's told us that one of the reasons he selected David to be king was what was in his heart. And we, as a result, have been asking, what was it about David that pleased God? And here, of course, we see part of the answer to that question. He is completely submissive to God's plan. And we see another part of the answer to that question, I think, in the response of David to the suffering of God's people. Before the writer even finishes up the story of the Amalekite who had brought news of Saul's death to David, he pauses in verses 11 and 12 to describe David's reaction to Israel's defeat by the Philistines. And then he returns to David's grief in verse 17 by sharing a specific lamentation that David wrote about the death of Saul and Jonathan. Now you have to think about that. David didn't only weep and mourn over the death of Saul and Jonathan. He sat down and wrote a poem about it, and he wanted that poem to be taught to others. It seems David believes there's a time for mourning, and there are lessons that should be learned from these times of mourning. After clearing up any misconceptions about David's attitude towards Saul and David's attitude towards Saul's death, the writer begins then to describe David's ascension to power in 2 Samuel chapter 2. And according to 2 Samuel 2:1, where does David begin? After this, David inquired of the Lord. The first thing we see in David after Saul dies is his complete submission to the will of God and his anger at compromise. We're learning what kind of king we need. He's not willing to go outside of God's plan. The second thing we see in David is that not only will he not go outside of God's plan, he wants to know what God's plan is so he can actively obey it. And he gets on his knees and he cries out to God. In verses 1 through 4, we see David asking God specifically if he should go up to Judah. And when God says he should, he does. When he arrives, verse 4 tells us the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah, which is a really big moment. It's been a while since Samuel anointed David as king, and you can think of all David's been through since then. After being anointed as king by Samuel, he spent the next years of his life running and hiding out in the wilderness. But finally, his kingdom is being established, and it starts with this one single tribe, Judah. Can sort of understand why Genesis made such a big deal out of Judah. It prepares us for this moment. And when David hears of the honor that the men of Jabesh Gilead had shown to Saul, he sends messengers to them to encourage them and thank them for their actions. And once again, we see that unlike Saul, David was not driven by selfish ambition. What kind of king do we need? We need a king who thinks about the good of the people, not just the good of himself. Obviously, the men of Jabesh Gilead would have been very loyal to Saul to do what they did for him, and yet David blesses them for their actions and promises to seek their best. At the same time, David now reaches out to them to submit to his kingship, explaining how Judah has anointed him king over them. But just because God has promised David the throne, it doesn't mean that everything will go easily. There's a time here where there is still a battle going on. David, in a sense, has won the war. He's king, but there's still battles going on. One of the reasons David has to make this appeal to Jabesh Gilead is because one of Saul's sons has illegitimately seized this opportunity to try to become king himself. And people knew that God had chosen David to be king, and we'll see that more clearly as we read 2 Samuel. And yet, in spite of that, Abner took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and set him up as king in opposition to God's plan. And honestly, at first, this opposition seems pretty intimidating. It comes primarily in the form of this man named Abner, and he was a powerful man, and he begins attacking God's plan with this show of violent force. And beginning in verse 12, we find Abner has come with his soldiers to the pool of Gibeon, which was very close to where David was located, actually. And it means that Abner has gone out from the place where Ishbosheth was exercising his rule to attack David. And Joab and the other servants of David have come to meet him in response. And in spite of Abner's attempts, he and his servants are beaten. And as a result, Abner runs. And one of Joab's brothers was especially a fast runner, and he pursues Abner, and Abner keeps warning him to stop, but he won't, and Abner ends up killing him, which makes his brothers angry, and they pursue Abner until Abner pleads with them to stop, and he attempts to sound spiritual by saying, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" And Joab listens to him, but the results of Abner's attack on God's kingdom are clear. When Joab had gathered all the people together, there were missing from David's servants 19 people besides his brother, but the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. Now, even though David and his men had won this victory at some cost, but they had won this victory, that didn't mean the war was over. Chapter 3 begins by telling us there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. This doesn't seem to discourage Abner, though, in his pursuits, because we see Abner is taking advantage of Ishbosheth's weakness to gain more and more power for himself. Chapter 3, verse 6 says, "While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul." And one of the ways he was asserting himself was by taking one of Ishbosheth's concubines for himself. And a concubine was basically a culturally accepted mistress. And there seems to have been a difference between a concubine and a wife in the culture's eyes. And yet concubines were known and they were taken care of by the man and, or you could say, I guess, the husband. Israel's fallen very far from God's standard here in accepting this practice. It was wicked, and Abner here is increasing the wickedness because he's taking the concubine of Ishbosheth for himself, and this was a big deal. It's kind of what Reuben tried to do, if you remember back in Genesis, and the reason Reuben did it and Abner did it is it was a way of asserting dominance, and Abner was basically putting himself in the place of Ishbosheth, and this accusation makes Abner angry. Ishbosheth finds out about it and he says, "What are you doing?" And that accusation makes Abner very angry, and he immediately switches his loyalty to the house of David, and he talks to Ishbosheth, and he makes clear that he knew what was going on. He knew what God was doing, and it was God's plan for David to be king of Israel, and he says he's going to help David accomplish that now. And Abner's not seeking the kingdom for the right reasons here, but he was seeking to help David at this point, and he attempts to make a covenant with David, and David agrees on one condition. He wants Michal back. You remember, the daughter of Saul. But this is a little bit of a tricky situation now, actually, because Michal didn't like David. She abandoned David, and she entered into an illegitimate marriage with someone named Paltiel. But Abner, he's going to do what David says, and he gets her from Paltiel, and Paltiel, her husband, goes out after her, and it's just a sort of pathetic picture with her weeping and weeping and him weeping and weeping until Abner says, "Please stop following us. Go back to where you came from," which is, I'm not sure everything that's saying, but it's definitely a sad reminder of the consequences of sin and jealousy. Saul had attempted to marry Michal to David, not for Michal's good, but for the purpose of killing David, and now we see that this self-centered way of living has long-term consequences and has brought pain not just to David, but instead to Saul's very own daughter as well. From here, Abner goes to the elders of Israel, and according to chapter 3, verses 17 through 18, he challenges them to make David king. And again, here, Abner's showing that he knew what was the right thing to do, but he's refused to do it up to this point. And he finally convinces them to listen, and he goes to David, and they have a big feast, and there's a covenant between David and Abner that's established, and David sends Abner away in peace. And yet, instead of honoring that covenant between David and Abner, Joab takes matters into his own hands, and he pursues Abner, and he murders him. And Obviously, he did that because Abner had murdered his brother, and we might be a little bit sympathetic to Joab's act of revenge, but it was revenge, and it was a wicked act, and it's doubly wicked because where Abner had gone was Hebron, which was a place of refuge established by Moses for those who had committed manslaughter, which is what Abner had done. And so Joab is lawless here, forgetting what was important to Moses and what was important to God, and going straight into the city and killing Abner. And later he is punished as a result. And again, I'm not totally sure of what we're supposed to learn from the story of Abner, Joab, and David completely, but perhaps one thing that we should take away is David's merciful example. If David is a type of Christ, a picture of the king we need, we're longing for and looking forward to in Jesus, we get here a picture of that king's amazing, overflowing mercy, even towards his former enemies. Abner was fighting against David, and if we were David and Abner was coming to us, most of us would have been tempted to respond like Joab, and yet we give praise to God because that's not the way Jesus responds to us when we come to him. In spite of all the opposition and all the obstacles, God's plan is now coming to fulfillment. And Ishbosheth hears of Abner's death, and he fears for his own life. The other descendant of Saul at this point, who might have made a claim to the throne, is crippled. And so all of Israel wonders what is going to happen next. And two of Ishbosheth's own captains, decide to take matters into their own hands, and they kill him as he's sleeping. The writer, if you look at the story, he tells us what they did twice, actually, I think in order to help us feel the shock of it. Listen, 1 Samuel 4:6, and they came into the middle of the house as if to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. And then again, verse 7, when they came into the house, as he lay on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and put him to death and beheaded him. While it's true that Ishbosheth was an illegitimate king and that David was destined to be king over all of Israel, once again we see in the story that reality does not make it right for people to compromise in order to make it happen. These men actually bring the head of Ishbosheth to David, and you can imagine the kind of men who would be willing to do something like that, to carry a head all the way to David. They even give what they think is a spiritual sounding reason for doing so. They say in verse 8, here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, this day on Saul and on his offspring. But David would have none of it. He condemns the men for their actions. He commands his young men once again to execute these men and to make an example of them for their sins. And you know, as we read all of this, we might wonder, how was David able to stay so calm and so settled and so committed to justice in the face of all the opposition that he was experiencing? For example, you could think of what Ishbosheth had been doing. Why wasn't David more relieved to hear of his death? Why wasn't David rejoicing with these men? We get a hint, I think, as we compare the difference between how the men who murdered Ishbosheth spoke and how David does. They say, here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. David says, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity. What was their perspective on what was happening to David? They thought he would rejoice in the death of his enemies. What was David's perspective? He's upset that they killed Ishbosheth because he's trusting in God to establish him, and he ends up judging them for their actions. And you know, sometimes we end up blaming our compromise on our situation, when instead the real reason we compromise is because we're not grateful for the ways that God is caring for us. We're not seeing the hand of God in our life, and we, as a result, are interpreting our circumstances in a way that leaves God out. Finally, after all of this, the people of Israel come to David, and they ask him to be their king. They want to appoint him as king. And the opening verses of chapter 5 demonstrate the way in which David was firmly established as king. And the writer here is going to want to bring together in this chapter a number of different stories that are going to illustrate the great successes that David experienced, how clearly God was on his side, and the blessings that came to Israel when they had the right kind of king. And we'll look more closely at that in the videos which follow, and especially at a promise that God is going to make to David that is key, absolutely key for understanding the rest of the Bible. But you'll have to come back next time.